So, Noam, so you joined Waze when it was a small little company. Like, what attracted you to Waze? Did you know it was going to become this big company? Like, what was it that you saw in it that made you interested in joining as a small little company?
So it's interesting. Before Waze, I was working for a company called Intercast, which was doing HD content delivery, trying to change the world. Looking back, it was the worst mistake I've made in my life, and probably one of the worst times of my life. And
how come?
Oh, many reasons. As we were shutting down the company, let's put it that way. As we were shutting down the company, though, I had a friend of a friend was working on fundraising for Waze. So we've been following each other along the way. We heard all the intricate stories. And when we started shutting down Intercast, I met him. And he told me this fantastic story about changing the world with smartphones and things. And it was everything that I had written down that I don't want to do again. It's like, big story, VC funded, out of Israel, Israeli VCs, a whole list of things I don't want to do again. And this like nailed them, each one. So I tried to try out the product. And it was actually the first app I'd ever installed on my phone. We're talking about Nokia E71. We're talking about the beginning of 2000, end of 2008. And I installed this, and I had been driving every day for 2 years to my office in Netanya, and it showed me a different way that was counterintuitive and shaved off 15 minutes off my commute. And that really was the moment where I was like, wow, this is, this is real. And sort of things took off from there. So I think when you look at where Waze was at the time, we were banking on several big trends. We assumed that there would be a GPS chip in every smartphone. And that was a huge bet at the time. And I remember when I joined the company, the first decision I had to make was, do we develop an app for BlackBerry or for the iPhone? And again, all the logic said to do it for BlackBerry. What did you decide? Luckily. I wouldn't be here if I had decided BlackBerry. But luckily, I decided to do the iPhone. But those are the kinds of things at the time, when we joined.
I think one of the things I actually see really common between Noam's story and some of mine is a lot of what I've seen I've had to do is try to predict what's happening in the future, and sort of this story of you're choosing between two different platforms to develop for, or you're making a bet that GPS is going to be in every single phone. I mean, so you basically sort of looked into the future, made some decisions based on how you believe the future is going to be, and then built a company around those decisions. And I think that's actually pretty similar to a lot of things that I see at Google. And when I first joined Google, which, I joined Google in '99, which really doesn't seem that long ago, but the internet was really just getting started.
So let me ask you the question, though.
Yes, I know, you're supposed to ask me the question.
Yeah, answer the question. So Google was seated in your garage, but how did things actually start? Everyone knows that story, but what really happened?
Yeah, so Sergey and Larry had started Google actually as this library research project. And I actually wasn't there, so I can't represent that part of the story that well. But apparently Larry had a number of different projects that he was interested in working on, and he actually had a dream. And he says it's one of the only dreams he's ever had. And in this dream, he had the vision that he should start Google. Although it wasn't quite Google at the time. It was the idea of actually being able to search the web.
A dream asleep or a dream I have a dream?
A dream asleep. I know, it's hard to believe. But so anyway, so they started this company really as a research project as PhD students at Stanford. And the goal of it at the time was to be able to understand all the different links of the web and who was linking to who. And so they didn't really have the whole idea of doing a search engine. It was more just a research project. And so they wound up creating this search engine. And at the time, when I joined them, it was already when they moved into our garage, there was basically no one was using it. It was on Stanford servers. In fact, they were always asking me, because I worked at Intel, they were always asking me, can we get some free machines from Intel? And but they think the thing is that we had basically this vision, which today is really obvious, which is that the web is going to get really, really big. And the web's going to be super important, and it's going to be the long tail of information that's going to be important, not just the head. And today that's obvious. Today we look at that and we think, of course that's the way the world is, right? We have billions and billions of web pages. But at the time, just to put this in perspective, Yahoo actually had a directory. And they had surfers. And if you wanted to be listed in the directory, you emailed them, and a person reviewed it. And then they posted it under this directory. And so they were really focused on the head. And Google at the end was focused on the tail and focused on enabling all the different types of information being found. And so I think one of the things that's really common is we made this decision of let's focus on the web just being ginormous. Let's focus on distributed systems and the fact that people all over the world can find information regardless of what they type in. Let's not just focus on one country or focus on specific head. And so I think that really drove a lot of the decisions. And so in some sense, the bet of Google, made the bet of GPSs and bet of which platforms, the bet of Google was that the web's going to be really big. And today that seems so obvious, and we'll have the technology and the search algorithms to be able to do that really well.
So when you talk about Google at the beginning as a startup, so Israelis usually are very experienced in the startup phase. Mm-hmm. And we don't think of Google as a startup in any sense. Well, I guess it depends who, but in general, you don't think of Google as a startup. And so when you're talking about the first sort of year of Google, there must have been several key decisions. So looking back, at the time you may or may not have known they were key. But when you look back, these were the key decisions that put sort of the trajectory. Can you share a few of those?
Sure. I think Google was definitely a startup when I joined. I was employee 16, and when I joined, there was really nothing. There was no revenue. I mean, they had the search engine, and we had one patent. And I think, and I think some of the decisions that were made in the very beginning that were important was just the decision of basically trying to be a consumer product and trying to focus on search. So that, the decision was, and actually the company had the mission, I remember hearing it, I think, for the first time, the first week I was there, which is to organize the world's information to be universally accessible and useful. And so when I, kind of think back about Google, I'm well, what did they do right? Because, there were some things that we did right. Definitely one of them was choosing, kind of looking forward, understanding what the world's going to be like in the future, and picking a big set of a big use case that we thought was going to be really significant, something that would really be meaningful to people, which is finding information, finding it all over the world, finding it real time, finding it fast. And we also had the goal of being able to enable information to be having good search. It was almost like a religion at Google. Everything at the company was not geared about making money. It was about having the best search experience. And so a lot of the search engines at the time were focused on actually making money and putting search results in the middle of the pages, unmarked, as basically ads. So you could pay and you could be in position 3, or you could pay and be in position 2. LookSmart had a whole business on this, and I don't remember exactly how all of them worked, but the fact that we were focused on the consumer, focused on the user, and doing the right thing and driving that usage. And so I think that was definitely a really important and big decision to just say we're going to focus on users, do the right thing for those users. We knew who our constituents were, and we'll make money later. And at the time, again, this is really obvious today. A lot of internet companies work today in terms of being consumer driven, but it wasn't as obvious then. And if you look at sort of some of the other search engines that wound up going out of business, they weren't as focused on consumers. They were confused about who their audience actually was. But it was very strange to join such a small company. And I'll just say, when you have 16 people and they're in your garage, but then in some sense they're becoming important. It was just really, really hard to recognize and reconcile in our head. If these guys are, and we talk to them and they'll be yes, we're going to build this world big search engine. And I'd say, well, how come you're in my garage if you're doing that? And then they'd be in the same breath, and they would say, can we use your washer and dryer? I'd be okay. So I didn't actually work there then. I was the landlord. I was, so it was sort of a different relationship. It was more don't forget about recycling. Make sure that we had all these, they actually got up to like 8 employees. And the house that we were in, a really small little house, is just like I think the whole house is less than 2,000 square feet, and it wasn't zoned in any way for commercial. So we had a lot of parking issues, and anyway, we dealt with them. I was like, please park in front of different neighbors' houses. Don't always park in front of the same neighbor's house. But we worked through those issues, and obviously Google has overcome those types of issues.
Although the parking issue is still not overcome.
The parking issue is still an issue. Yeah, it's been a long-term issue.
We always get told park near the YouTube parking lot because there's no room here.
The YouTube also has its own issues with parking too, yes. It's a growing company issue, parking. All right, question for Noam. Okay, so can you talk, so you joined Waze, and you saw that it was saving time for people, and you built for the iPhone, which was a good decision. And strategic decision. And then did it just take off from there? Like, did it just launch and then, magic, it was distributed everywhere? Or did you actually
have to work?
Did you actually have to do work? Were you like worried about anything? What was sort of the next stage? Were you did you know it was going to be a success, or did you launch it and nobody used it? I mean, sort of what happened?
Obviously, as the CEO, I had a strategic vision, and I could see 7 years into the future, and it was obvious to me what was going to happen. So from day one, we had a very, very clear plan with multiple steps in Excel drawn out. Yeah, so we had no idea what was going to happen.
Did you really have a plan?
No, of course not. Our planning cycles were 3 weeks. That was like the maximum visibility we had. So when we got started, so Waze produces its own maps, and when we got started, there was a duopoly in the world. There was TeleAtlas, and there was Navtec. Navtec got bought by Nokia for $8 billion, and TeleAtlas got bought by TomTom for $4 billion, which basically got us our A round. That's what it got us. But when people looked at what we were trying to do, they were going to get a bunch of volunteers with some smartphones. We're going to compete with companies with 4,000 employees and trucks and infrastructure. We've been doing this for 10 years. I mean, Microsoft had evaluated building its own map and decided it was impossible and too expensive. So you, 12 guys in a garage, are going to do it. That was sort of the feeling out there. And one of the things that gave us a lot of confidence was that the product had taken off in Israel specifically. So all the Israelis here probably know, but the product began as Ehud Shabtai, the founder's garage project on his balcony, which is the Tel Aviv equivalent of a garage. And he basically built this whole thing on his own, and it really got an excited group of people behind it. And what had happened, his girlfriend had gotten him an iPac at the time with some navigation software, and he was blown away. The first time he'd seen a GPS and navigation software, he was very excited about it, driving around, started playing around, found some APIs, and actually built an app on top of it. Yeah, obviously he didn't call it apps then, but it built an app that you could mark where speed cameras were. And he released this to a full room of the iPac users. And within a few days, they'd mapped out all the speed cameras in Israel. Now, basically, people would email him the file, he would merge the files together, he'd email it back to them, he'd sync your iPac, your computer. It's very clumsy, but it worked, and it was gaining popularity. And then he got a cease and desist letter from the map company. So that's the equivalent of Navtec in Israel, a company called Mapa. And they were the monopoly in Israel. And they basically told him, you can't use the map for this anymore. And he couldn't understand it. There was a meeting, today it's already considered a famous meeting, but at the time he's sitting there with these people. I said, look, I don't understand. I'm giving this away for free. People like it, they're using it. What's wrong? And they said, no, you're infringing on our terms and conditions. If you start charging money, we'll take a portion of it, but you can't give it away for free. So he basically said, fuck you, and deleted the map, and used this original group of people to begin recording GPS traces and to begin building the map. And at the time, it was considered impossible to do this. But somehow, people got together and began building this. And so it reached a point when the company raised its A round in March of 2008, that already there was a group of 8,000 Israelis, roughly, using it. It was like a secret for the high-tech community, the people who were using it. So for us, when we got started and we launched in the US in 2009, we assumed we were going to get the same excitement that we saw in Israel in the US. Because obviously, if it works in Israel, it's got to work everywhere. And not only did we assume it was going to take off, our big marketing solution was we can give it away for free. Because at the time, the only way you could get a map is to buy it from this duopoly. The duopoly charged a tremendous amount of money for it. So you had to charge about $10 a month for the service to be able to support it. And
was Google Maps not out yet?
No, there was no Google Maps. Google Maps had been on the web, but there was no mobile maps. No mobile maps. And when Apple came out with the Google mobile maps thing, it didn't have turn-by-turn navigation because that was considered the big blocker, and we were giving it away for free. And so we come out in 2009, we discover that free is not enough. If your product sucks, you can't even give it away for free. And our product sucked. It was terrible. Like, we would get you lost, we would kill your battery, we would use up your data plan, and we couldn't find anything. It was really, really bad. But we started sort of improving, and then really Google came out with the free turn-by-turn navigation. And they basically disrupted the whole map industry, which is what we were going to do. They stole our thunder, they stole our big move, and that was sort of the crisis point in the company. And looking back, it was actually we were very fortunate for it to happen when it happened, because it forced us to ask all those hard questions. So you said at Google, you sort of knew, we're focused on the consumer, and we want to have the best search. At Waze, we weren't 100% sure. Our model was we're going to use the community to build these maps, but then we're going to sell the data. That's how we're going to monetize. And so we're always stuck in this question of what's more important, the consumer experience or the quality of the data. Now, if the quality of data supports the consumer experience, it's simple, but many times it doesn't. And these are the kind of issues we were debating. We were debating the question of, are we a navigation provider, or are we doing something new, which was commuting at the time and focusing on real-time data and things like that. And within the company, there were two camps. As you can imagine, we can define them as the iPhone camp and the BlackBerry camp. But this forced us to make these decisions, and we really made the decision to focus on community, on the consumer, on that experience. And that focus is really what allowed us to grow Waze sort of to what it was. And I think that without that trauma, it would have been extremely difficult to get there.
Did you lose hope at any point? I mean, obviously not, but...
Obviously I did, many times. The worst thing was actually, after Google had come out, we had been negotiating a term sheet with a venture fund, and immediately they disappeared. And we basically got into this sort of the valley of death, as it's called, where our product's out there, it's okay, it doesn't have the traction that you need, and literally nobody wants to talk to you. And so we spoke to all the venture funds in Israel, we spoke to many other venture funds here, and literally people would just like laugh us out of the room. And I think that's the big challenge for a startup going through this, is really to believe. And what really helped us in believing was having consumers using the app and seeing what they do. Now, this is something you can't explain to a venture capitalist when he's expecting you to show growth like that. But when you hear what these people are saying about how you've changed the way they drive, about hours that they spend editing your map, their involvement on a personal level, you understand you're onto something. And that was probably the North Star for us, was just that feedback we constantly got from users. And that's why I say a lot of times to the startups that are starting out, it matters what the first users say much more than how many you have. What do they do with the application?
Yeah, I think Google was similar when it first started out too. Like the stories that we would receive from people who found stuff on the web and changed their life in some way were so moving. I mean, today we take search to be a utility, and we think, like, of course we should be able to find things, and if we can't, then we're upset. But in the beginning, you have to remember, like, we didn't have this as a tool, and so people would write to us and say, like, I mean, just amazing stories about, like, my daughter had this illness, and, like, I couldn't find anyone who could treat her, and, I used your service, and I found a doctor, I figured out what it was, and, like, here's my daughter and the doctor together, right? So they would send us pictures and tell us these really emotional stories. So it also was very similar where even if we weren't making money, it didn't, I mean, yes, the money mattered, but the fact that we were changing people's lives all over the world really did make a difference. And so we were motivated by that. And that's also sort of what drove a lot of the religion of the company, that search has to be really important, that of course we can't put ads right in the middle, because that would mean that, this mom and this daughter might not really find what they want to have. And I think it, like, kind of similarly, they would write to us and it would really inspire and drive us to make the right decisions.
So I'm supposed to ask you about the biggest mistake Google has made the last 10 years.
Yeah.
But I thought before I ask you that, I'll actually ask myself that question.
Okay. What's the biggest mistake you made?
Oh, interesting you should ask that.
Yeah.
Well, since you asked, when Google came out with the Google Maps and our product wasn't growing and all these other things, we actually took our eyes off the ball. We had originally said the US market is all that matters. If you succeed in the US, you'll succeed anywhere in the world. And all our resources were on it. With all the chaos that happened, we actually decided to try and look much more at the Latin American market and try to hedge our bets. And I think that was definitely driven by fear, and it was probably we probably wasted 4 to 6 months, which is a lifetime in a startup's life, in terms of our ability to deliver a good service in the US. And I think the lesson, at least to me here, is one of the problems you have as a startup is that you think you're competing with these companies, startups, whatever. You're not competing with anyone. You're competing with people thinking your product is stupid. That's your competition. And until you reach a point where anybody even takes, when you're in the game, where somebody cares about what you're doing, it's such a long distance to go. And for us, that fear of a competition really made us sort of, it forced us to look the wrong way. And I think that, when I look back as something that was a critical mistake. Second mistake, which we were very lucky on, was that that Microsoft didn't make an offer to buy the company on our B round a long time ago, and we'd almost gotten to that point, and we were extremely lucky because we were at the point where we had looked away from the goal and would probably have taken the offer had it happened. So that I would put the category of more luck than brains rather than a decision.
Yeah.
And how about Google?
How about Google? I mean, I think overall, I'd say, I think Google has a longer life in that we've been in the market for 16 years, and during that time we've been through a number of transitions. And so I think overall, when I kind of look back and I think about a lot of the decisions that we've made, I feel a lot of them, have been, we've been lucky that a lot of them we've made good decisions. I mean, probably the biggest transition that we've gone through that was really significant was the mobile one. And you sort of look at mobile and you think about how much that changed the landscape of companies kind of across the board, like BlackBerry, Nokia. I mean, there were a number of companies that were very, very significant before the smartphone market that, for whatever reason, missed that change. And I think we've always pointed out in technology, a lot of the big changes are not incremental, they're disruptive. And they come up on you really, really fast, and you don't expect those changes to be as significant as they are. And I remember people in mobile saying, next year is going to be the year of mobile. And so people who had worked in mobile felt like it was never really going to happen, but then finally one year, it really, really did happen. And so I think, I think one really positive thing that we did was actually understand that mobile was going to be important, and the development of the Android operating system was significant to us as a company in sort of having that foresight. And at the time, when we bought Android and we started working on it, it didn't really seem like it kind of seemed like an extracurricular. It seemed like an investment that was unclear how this would actually pay off. It was a cool technology. Was it actually going to become real? Was it going to become significant and important for the company? And so I think a lot of it, again, is sort of looking out, believing the future, believing that the future really is going to be different in 5 years than it is today. And what do you need to have in that market 5 years from now that you don't have today? And so I think that was a really significant one. I think probably I'd say one of the things that, so again, I feel like most of the decisions we've made have been overall pretty good. I think one of the things that has probably been harder for us has been the social area. And I think a lot of that, there's been rise of a lot of big social networks, and I think it's actually been pretty exciting and interesting for people across the board. And there's been a lot of startup activity here, and I think in Google, probably the whole concept of identity, who you are on the web. We actually talked about it for a long time. I think we knew it was important, but it took time for us to build that and to build that across all of our products and to build that in. And in the meantime, there've been a number of different social networks that have been successful. And I think that was probably one that was a little bit harder for us. And I think a lot of times this gets back to the missions of the company and what the company's strengths are and what they're good at. When you're in a big market and you're a big company, it's hard to be good at everything. You just can't do everything. And so part of being a big company and part of being a startup is having focus and saying these are the things that we do really well, and these are the things that we can excel at. And so I think I sort of look at it and we do really good basically, technologies that enable people across the web, Chrome, Android operating systems, ads that monetize the web, search, like these types of things. And so, I think, Google, basically bringing identity, knowing who people are, being able to use those connections is something that we've, actually Waze has been really good at that. And I think, that's something that we've been building into our products, but it probably, in retrospect, would have been good for us to have done earlier.
Which is also a general question about what really is social.
Yeah.
And that's still out there, it's still unclear. I mean, as Mark Zuckerberg tries to do search, on the one hand, and there was a lot of talk about social search, there was a lot of talk about social commerce, there are all these different things, and then the rise of social networks on the mobile space. I mean, what WhatsApp did is just phenomenal, right? I mean, who could have imagined a company going that fast and building up, 600-700 million actives, so fast? But what did that mean for the next one? And that's actually a very interesting, I think, trend we're seeing in mobile. Things can, new companies can rise, the velocity of the whole industry has just accelerated dramatically.
I mean, I think the industry has accelerated a lot just because of all the different infrastructure that's out there, and people can actually build these apps. They have the phones. There's such a broad base of people who have access to these phones and can download the apps really quickly and easily. And so the rise of these new apps and these new services and people being willing to try it has really accelerated a lot of the innovation across the board of the industry. And so I think WhatsApp is one, but there are a whole bunch of other ones, Snapchat and Instagram, and I mean, we could probably go on and on and on about all the different social services that have really just risen in the last, I mean, Facebook's been around for a while, Twitter's been around for a while, but these other companies haven't been around for nearly as long, and the innovation that they've had has been really significant.
And it's interesting because I think we're seeing velocity as a key metric of success, where in the past there were many other metrics. I think velocity, and velocity does not mean being the first mover advantage, but just the ability to move very, very fast is becoming a core value or attribute for successful companies. And that's a DNA. And one of the things that we always prided ourselves at Waze was never doing 100%. We want to do 80% of anything. Any investment we do beyond the 80% is a waste. And that's very hard to do, because obviously the 20% are going to complain, and it's also a certain DNA for the company. Obviously engineers want to have a perfect solution. And to try and say, no, it's good enough, is a very difficult sort of DNA to absorb. But I think it's one of the things we managed to absorb till today. It's one of the places maybe that we clash with Google, now. But in general, as a DNA, being focused on just doing good enough and not the best was very important for us, for our velocity.
I guess one thing I'll say, sort of coming from now, representing the big company, as opposed to, Google, the startup. I think, and a lot of you represent entrepreneurs and companies or thinking about starting companies. And so I think, when we actually acquire companies, a lot of times what we're acquiring is the fact that there was a dedicated and a focused team that understood a new area that we couldn't do, given that we're a bigger company focused. We already have a lot of things that we're focused on. And then that company had focus, dedication, and actually probably took some risks that might have been harder for us to take as a bigger company, and proved that those risks were correct. And so I think sort of as you think about your own companies and what you're starting and building it, I think the value of what we're looking for a lot of times is acceleration in a new area that otherwise we can't accelerate into, and showing that they've been able to, that they took some risks and that they proved that those were the right risks to take.
This is probably, I think, the hardest thing for us now being part of Google is trying to understand, when you're a company at the scale of Google, you look at the world differently. And the world looks at you differently, and your risks are different, and your resource constraints are different. And it's been extremely hard for us to go through this process. And that's to do with the quality of service, of things, the amount of risk you can take. And risk is a huge thing, right? We used to just push a version out, then let's see if it works, right? And we used to not have any QA at all. The community did the QA, or Errol did it on his drive home. And suddenly to think that you're pushing out something that's going to hundreds of millions of users, and that you're being viewed already as an extension of the Google brand creates a lot of constraints. The legal constraints that Google goes through are mind-boggling. And so these are the kind of things that I've found as very, very interesting or challenging, but definitely give me a lot of more hope for what startups can do. Because people like to say in Israel that large companies are firing for buying these startups, but really these startups can do things legally that a large company can't. And when they get away with it, they've actually ended up building something that could not have started within a large company. So I think we're going to open up some questions. I don't know if we have a microphone.
You guys have a microphone?
There is a microphone.
All right, so let's see. Well, we get questions. I'll ask Noam one. So Noam, you said you were, okay, so this is an Israeli, we have a lot of Israelis here, and you said in the beginning that you had on your checklist that you did not ever want to start a company again in Israel. But then you did. So maybe you can, and then you moved your headquarters from Israel to here. So you can maybe talk a little bit about like pros and cons. Like clearly it worked out really well for you to have the company in Israel. You said Israel was like the most important test market. Maybe talk a little bit like about pros and cons of being an Israeli company versus a Silicon Valley company.
I think one of the hardest parts I have, I think a lot of people are Israelis here that are living here, and I'm sure everyone will understand completely what I'm talking about. It's very hard to explain to someone who's living in Israel about Silicon Valley. Something you can't really explain logically. It's like trying to explain to an American Jew what Israel is. The fact that you're an American Jew doesn't mean you're going to be able to do business in Israel. It probably means the opposite, right? And the fact that you're an Israeli doesn't mean you understand Silicon Valley or can really fit in here. But there is something very unique about Silicon Valley, about the velocity in which things happen. And I found that I moved here in the summer of 2010 for 3 months, just to close the B round. After like 3 weeks here, I told my wife, look, let's sign the kids up for school, whatever, we've got to stay. Because the levels of exposure you have to other companies, the level of connections that you have, the access you have is phenomenal, but it's phenomenal in ways that are different than what I'd thought before I'd lived here. And obviously, if you're running a startup in Israel, and I've run startups out of Israel all my life, if you're running a startup out of Israel and Steve Ballmer calls you up and says, hey, I want to have lunch, you're going to fly halfway around the world to meet with him. But if some junior product manager from Microsoft sends you an email asking something, you're probably not going to go to that lunch. And that lunch, the importance of that lunch is not with Steve Ballmer. It's with that junior product manager who happens to have something and it gathers momentum. And next thing you know, you're actually meeting with Steve Ballmer in a different context. And I think these were the kind of things that are very, very difficult to explain to people who are not here. And this is why I think American startups have a lot of velocity. For us, our big sort of equivalent was Foursquare. So we're both in the location space, we're both mobile-first companies, we're both doing things that we knew Dennis, and so we knew each other a little bit, and we watched their velocity with envy. It was unbelievable. Everyone wrote about them, everyone talked about them, they were all over the world, their users were growing, the whole package. And regardless of sort of how things worked out later on, that velocity, especially in the consumer space, is something you cannot get from Israel. And I don't know of any examples of companies that have done that out of Israel and gotten that velocity, because it's people you have lunch with, and it's people that you meet, and it's one thing leads to another, next thing you know you're at. And this is what I try to explain to many Israeli startups, that this is your competition. Your competition is Foursquare. That's super connected, knows everyone, has built already a company, had worked at Google, that's your competition. And you need to figure out how to solve that. Not to explain that you have great technology. That doesn't matter. How are you going to solve that problem? How do you feel the access to media, the access to partners, the access to influencers and decision makers? And so for us, moving here was a critical stage, and I think that the whole company felt it once we had moved here. The other aspect was also we could not get our product right until I had moved here. And that's just as much as we think that the world is global and that we can get things done and et cetera. I moved here, our office was in Palo Alto. I started living in Los Altos, so I'd have a 20-minute commute in the morning. That was the reason. So every day I could use the app in the morning. And there are many things that are just different in the way the road network in the US operates and the Israeli road network, and different things operate, which are hard to understand. You can't just peg them as a technicality. Exit right versus keep right. For an American, keep right means nothing. Exit right means something when you're on a highway. In Hebrew, it works pretty well. So there were these kinds of issues which are small but have a huge impact that you just don't understand until you live here for a while. Anyone have a question?
All right.
Oh, here we
Two
go.
questions.
Susan, so Google has been very active in the M&A era. And I was wondering if you can compare and contrast the assimilation process of Waze from other M&A activities and merging with other companies. And there's something unique about assimilation of an Israeli company into Google versus other companies. And Noam, I was wondering if you can talk about this, from your point of view, from your vantage point, about what does it feel to run an Israeli company versus being part of a large American companies?
No. Yeah, I mean, I think Google definitely buys and acquires a lot of companies, and I think I've personally acquired a number of really both big and small companies over the course of my career, including DoubleClick, and actually I was very active in the YouTube acquisition. I think, in general, like kind of the way I think about the acquisitions, I think there are two different types. I'd say they're like big companies, and then there's which we generally acquire because they're the leader in the space of an area that we want to be in that we don't think we can get into unless we make an acquisition. I'll put DoubleClick in that area. Like, DoubleClick had basically relationships with a lot of advertisers and publishers. We realized that we could compete, but it would probably take us like 10 years. And there was risk. And we really wanted to be in the display business and the brand business, and it was essential to us. It was essential to our ad business, so it was worth paying $3 billion for. And I think looking back on it, it was a successful acquisition, and people generally feel really good about it. So I think there are large companies that we acquire because they're in a space that we know we want to be in. I think, there are also companies, and I'll say the small companies, that we look at more, I'll say sometimes from like a talent perspective. Like they have a team that has expertise that we would want to have. They've actually probably developed in a specific area or have knowledge, and we want them to come to Google. We either use their product or they have that product rebuilt on Google infrastructure. I'd say for so I'd say we do, kind of those two buckets of acquisitions. I think for the first one, when they're strategic in some way of a market, and usually there's like not a lot of other companies we could buy in that space. Like there's one or two, and those are usually big acquisitions for us. I think there it doesn't matter where they're located, because wherever they are, like they're the only one, and we will buy them regardless of it. And I mean, at a certain price, it's reasonable for the company. And I think for talent acquisitions, we'll also tend to look more at location, because a lot of that is about actually the connections with the people and bringing those people to Google. And so Google at the size that we're at now, with global offices all over the place, like ads, we had offices. It was impossible to have everyone in the team awake at the same time. Like when you have people in both Europe and Shanghai, like you can't run an all hands and have everybody awake. It's just, it's impossible. So it's really hard. And so we do have offices everywhere, but we do try to, as much as possible, to have that office, if we do an acquisition, to be in a center of excellence that we have for that product, as opposed, like if they're in Missouri, sometimes I'll look and I'll be like, well, there's no way. Ask them if they want to move. If they don't want to move, just forget it. So I think, location does play a big role in it too.
So I think there are a few things that are unique about the Waze acquisition. From what I've seen so far, we're about a year into the acquisition now. One is that I think Google made they made a promise which they lived up to. We didn't really believe them in the beginning, but they're going to keep us as an independent unit. And that was kept completely, meaning the same org chart, same structure, people report to the same people. Only things that were really integrated were HR, legal, finance. But everything in terms of the way the company operates was kept independent, including the languages we develop on and the platforms that we use and our relationships with third parties. Google was phenomenal on keeping all that. I would add that we finally saw what it's like we grew by 60% in the last year, and this is something we could never have done on our own. I mean, the hiring machine that Google has, and it's not just the people, but it's also the expertise, has been just phenomenal. And they've allowed us to keep our DNA in terms of the type of people we hire, but obviously I think we were very lucky that the bar we set originally was very, very high for the company. So there's a very good cultural fit between our people and the Google people. But overall, we went from 100 to we're almost 170 now in the last year. Thanks to that, that's also been phenomenal. One thing that's been fascinating is sort of seeing the kimono gets lifted up once you join Google, and suddenly you see the inside of the operations. And there's some things that you're looking at, you're shocked in a positive sense. Some things you're shocked in a negative sense. But you just see the scale this company operates on. It's just something that you can't, as someone coming from the startup space and someone who grew up in Israel, you can't imagine scale on this level. It's a fascinating experience. That being said, the fact that we kept the org chart means that I'm the buffer to the organization. And there are many, many things that are extremely difficult. Today we're at a point where almost half of the company wasn't there at the acquisition. And so it's a very different DNA of someone getting hired in than someone who had grown up with the company and knew all the stories and et cetera, for someone who just came in for a job. Yes, he's excited and everything. And so we're definitely having a very hard struggle keeping our DNA and maintaining it, and there's nothing we can do about it. Over time, it's going to change, and it's already changing. And for everyone out there thinking to sell the company, it's a very, very difficult process on a personal level to try and preserve something, and you have this conflict about the good of your team and the good of Google on the whole, and how do you manage those conflicts? So it's definitely not easy. But I think that this mode of keeping companies independent, something Google has done now with several acquisitions, I think other companies, Facebook has done that, I think it's becoming more and more of a mode of acquisition for a certain size company, and I think it's critical. So far we've had zero attrition in terms of users. We've managed to exceed all the goals that we had, so operationally we're doing very well, and I think the main reason is really that we kept the company independent.
All right, let's do another question.
So I'm interested in how you reconcile two very different things. In Google in particular, the feeling of being a Googler, and I was there for a year, is that no matter what department, I mean, at least with engineering, you could be anywhere, right? There's mobility within the company, there's a single identity. But at the same time, Noam, you talk about the value of keeping the identity of an acquisition. And I know, Susan, for YouTube, my understanding is people work actually for YouTube even today, not just for Google Video, if that brand even existed. It seems like an interesting mix between one company and autonomous subcultures. I'm curious how that plays out.
Yeah.
So I think when I look at the core difference between a large company and a startup's DNA is defined by the product. Everyone in the company, their reason to exist is for the product to be successful. And every day you wake up in the morning, you ask yourself, what am I doing for the product or the community or my users, whatever it is? But there's complete alliance between everyone in the company about what we're doing. Obviously, we don't agree how, but that's all that matters. In a company like Google, the alliance is to Google.
It's a what? Group?
To the Google. Mm-hmm. To the brand of Google. So as someone at Google, you could be working at YouTube, you could be working on search, you could be working on something new, you could work on infrastructure, and what you care about is the growth of the brand and the umbrella of the products. And this is a very, very different DNA between the two companies. And that's, I think, our challenge within Waze is to keep the people that are there associated with the brand, with the product. And I'll be very frank, it's a challenge because even the way compensation happens and promotions happen, all these different things, the way they happen in a large company, it's a policy that's not going to change for us. There's a structure for it, and this structure has a different goal. It's to align you with the Google brand and how you're helping with Google and not with your specific product. And so that is probably the biggest tension we have, is on that. So far, I can say we've had one person who's moved to a role within Google, and we helped them as much as we want. We definitely don't want, obviously we don't want to force anyone to do anything, but overall I think people will stay because they love the product and they love the team that they're working with, et cetera, which is probably the same as the reason why people stay in YouTube or stay anywhere else. But that is definitely, I think, a very, very big difference between how startups operate and big companies operate, and that's the hardest problem on the integration. The first few months is where you have the hardest challenge, trying to understand the logic. Like coming from a product logic, you can't understand Why are we wasting our time talking about this? It's irrelevant to my users and to my product. But this is a very big corporate issue that has to be discussed. So that's the gap and the communication gap I think that happened in the beginning.
I mean, I think about Google now as really being a collection of a bunch of different companies. And those companies have a lot of synergies and they have a lot of opportunities to be able to work together. But there are almost like microcultures within the different areas of Google. But I think from an employee standpoint, that's actually good because it gives you the opportunity to try different things. Like you can still be at Google and you can work on, you know, the Android, you could work on, you know, you could switch to YouTube, you could work on core, like core search. So I think employees really like it because it gives them the opportunity to move around without actually leaving the company and still kind of keeping their network. But you know, sort of managing YouTube, like, which is really its own company within a company, just as Waze is its own company within a bigger company. Yeah, I mean, I think most of the time everything is aligned, but there are times sometimes where there's like a Google issue maybe that isn't as relevant to YouTube, or there's something happening at Google that we need to pay attention to that if we were a completely independent company probably wouldn't affect us. So. On the other hand, like we get a lot of benefits, like, you know, the ad sales team, the infrastructure, like all, you know, all of those different types of things. So I think it's, you know, there's both there like a lot of really, you know, important advantages, but there needs to be coordination. And like I'll just say YouTube probably, I mean, unlike Waze, is we actually have people moving back and forth all the time. And I think that's probably because it's been integrated for a lot longer and there's a lot more relationships. And it's actually good to have those relationships because people can you know, move back and forth and like recruit new people from Google and continue to grow that way.
I think the one thing though that is obviously the same anywhere is your manager at the end of the day is your number one reason for staying or leaving. Yes, there's compensation, there's all these other things, but at the end of the day, it's the team that you're in and the manager and what's going on within that team. And as you grow bigger and bigger, it becomes harder by definition to preserve that. And that's, I think the challenges that we're going through, we probably would have gone through anyway as we grew. But obviously, it's exacerbated when you're within a larger company.
Right. So let's do one or two more.
At this point, I think we're out of time. We thank our speakers very much. We're going to go into the breakout sessions. Okay, we have a little time for coffee.
Good move.
All right, good move. Coffee. All right, thank you.